Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile 1 discussion. The last few days have been an interesting few ones in PathOfExile's Mercenaries League. Firstly, we had all of the chaos that took place on the Trade League economy after players realised that Tier 16.5 mapping could actually considerably eclipse Tier 17 mapping, and as a result we saw a massive divestment of Chaos Orbs, followed by a fix to a major bug that was making 16.5s more lucrative than intended, and that sort of all partially reversed, but the economy is still not exactly the same as it was before all of the madness hit. Anyways, that's things that are more serious. Today though, we've got something that's just a little bit of fun. GGG Games have started putting out 1 or 2 news posts per league that is information about statistics related to the current league. And there's some really interesting stuff in here because I think it shows that they've handpicked a few items, including a few that are really desirable to players, to be more common on Mercenaries than would otherwise be the case. So let's take a look at the Mercenaries of Trathas stats that they put out today. This is based upon the first 11 days of the league, plus part of day 12. So it's not going to cover drops that have taken place in the last 72 hours or something like that. The first 2 of these statistics relate to leveling uniques that have come from Mercenaries. So we're not talking about drops that have come from monsters, we're talking about ones where a Mercenary is wearing one of these items. There are Wanderlusts and Tabula rases that are the items being discussed here. Now, fun fact, players have done a bunch of testing and have found that Tabula rasa is something like 6.5 times as rare as Wanderlust. We don't know the exact number, but it's that sort of ballpark. So basically, for every 100 Wanderlusts that drop, you'd expect something like 16 Tabulas. Well, that is definitely not the case when it comes to what Mercenaries wear. Wanderlust has spawned on just under 100,000 Mercenaries in the campaign. Again, we're only talking about the campaign, we're not talking about endgame maps here. And about half of them were skipped. Tabula, on the other hand, this has spawned on just over 125,000 Mercenaries, so something like 30% more likely to spawn than Wanderlust, even though when it comes to regular monster drops, Tabula is something like 84 or 85% less likely to drop than Wanderlust is. I gave a little thought to this discrepancy and speculated on a couple of things that could explain it. Firstly, maybe GGG Games consider Tabula rasa's unusual interaction with attribute requirements, which is something that's a hidden stat on the item, that it has no attribute requirements and no energy shield. Maybe this means it's allowed on all types of Mercenaries. Can't personally verify this though because I haven't had Tabula show up on a Mercenary. And then that would leave Wanderlust to be intelligence gear, even though its intelligence requirement is so low that even a level 1 character of any class can meet it. So that was one possibility, but ultimately I think the most likely thing is that GGG Games have thought, what is the most iconic item in leveling in PathOfExile? It's Tabula. So why don't we modify the loot tables and just increase the chance for Tabula from this new mechanic by quite a chunk? And then Wanderlust they may not have done the same thing for, and just left it to have the same chance as any other tier 5 rarity unique that's available from low levels. And then when we jump from the most common unique category in the game, tier 5 uniques, and one of the unique tiers that's not too much rarer than that, the tier 3s, and we jump up to the very rarest uniques in the game, things look a little bit different. So we've got the Squire. Now for a Mercenary to be able to equip the Squire, it needs to meet a few conditions. Firstly, it needs to use a shield. Secondly, it needs to be one that is not banned from using a strength and dexterity base. So that means that the Mercenary needs to be not an intelligence-based Mercenary at all. And then on top of that, it needs to roll a Squire. So this is something that you're probably not going to see all that often, and that's been exactly the case. Keep in mind the Squire, Rakiata's Dance, Defiance of Destiny, Soul Taker, Kalandra's Touch, Headhunter, Mageblood, all of these are amongst the rarest unique items that exist in the game. So very few Squires have spawned. Very few Rakiata's Dances have spawned, slightly more than the number of Squires, but this is still within normal statistical expectations. Defiance of Destiny also very, very, very rare, only 8 of them. Soul Taker only appearing on 9. But then we have the real surprises. Kalandra's Touch, Headhunter, and Mageblood. 356 Kalandra's Touches, 211 Headhunters, 157 Magebloods. Now note that not all of these were successfully looted. A good number of people run straight past Mercenaries or run straight past some Mercenaries, and amongst the ones that do engage with them, some of them end up being defeated by the Mercenary. For example, 34 players fought Kalandra's Touch Mercs and ended up losing their duels. 47 of them chose a sorted low-value currency instead. The reason that I think that number is quite high with Kalandra's touch, something like 13.5% of all Kalandra's touches, whereas it's a lower number, something like 5% for Headhunter and something like 9% for Mageblood. What I think is going on there is that Headhunter probably has the most iconic art in the game, and Mageblood is something that every experienced player knows about. But Kalandra's touch, I'd actually have to look up what it looks like. It's something that I've worn on characters before, but they can't remember exactly what it looks like. So it's more obvious at first glance if you've got one of the chase belts than it is if you've got any of the other very, very rare items here. However, there is absolutely no way that 356 Kalandra's touches have spawned and only 9 Soul Takers, and that this isn't something that's direct intervention by GGG Games here. What I think they've done is they've just handpicked a few unique items that are high profile, specifically Tabula Rasa, specifically Kalandra's Touch, Headhunter, and Mageblood, and they've decided to make them far more common than they otherwise would be, as a little bit of a reward for engaging with this mechanic. All that said, they definitely haven't done the same thing when it comes to Mirrors of Kalandra, because there have been very few mercenaries that have spawned with Mirrors of Kalandra, and this has led to someone drawing the conclusion that there are actually more people who have claimed to loot a Mirror of Kalandra from a mercenary on the PathOfExile 1 subreddit than there are people who have actually looted one. So that's a little bit of a reminder to you that just because you read about an uncommon or rare event that's taken place and it's posted on social media, then it's not necessarily true. Perhaps one of the most confusing parts of this, and also one of the more interesting ones, is the reference to one very, 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 very rare mercenary. Now, the infamous Warpriest of the Ruckus. There is an infamous Warpriest, there is a Warpriest, but there is also in the game files an infamous Warpriest of the Ruckus. This is apparently an Easter egg, and it's a reference to Mark from GGG Games, who apparently goes by Ruckus sometimes in online games. So this is essentially the equivalent of coming across Krilson when you're running a map. It's something that's just an extremely, extremely rare Easter egg. This has spawned exactly once so far in the league, and the player who spawned it did not interact with it. Apparently, it is something of the order 1 in 60 million to encounter this in a map, so GGG Games aren't even confident that it's going to happen again. But that's just one of those super rare Easter eggs, one of those weird things that people didn't know was possible, and apparently it is possible, but it's not something that's important to get for any reason. It's just something that's weird that could happen in a map. Anyways, that's a bunch of statistics, a little bit of fun there, but I think the most interesting thing is that it looks like GGG Games have gone out of their way to make certain high-profile unique items appear more often than they otherwise would. You probably won't find a mercenary that's using Mageblood, Headhunter, or Kalandra's Touch, but it's much more likely than finding one that's using Soul Taker, Rakiata's Dance, or Squire, or for that matter, even Defiance of Destiny, which is arguably the 4th highest profile of the Tier 0 rarity uniques. I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlorbs have interesting results, and may every mercenary that you don't stop for be the one that was carrying a Mirror of Kalandra or two.